Welcome to the Podkey Summary of Richard M. Daley. Richard M. Daley ran Chicago for 22 years, long enough to reshape the skyline, the city's finances, and the way power worked at City Hall. His record is one of those big, unmistakable city legacies that looks very different, depending on where you stand. Millennium Park and a shinier downtown on one side, patronage scandals, fiscal strain, and deep questions about accountability on the other. And the through line is pretty clear. Daley believed in strong mayoral control, fast action, and getting things done, even when that meant blowing past the usual checks, sometimes literally in the middle of the night. Daley became Chicago's longest-serving mayor, outlasting even his father, and he used that long stretch in office to push a pretty ambitious version of what Chicago could be. He helped turn the city into more of a global destination for tourism, business, and conventions, with Millennium Park, a remade Navy pier, expanded downtown development, environmental initiatives, and the takeover of Chicago public schools all becoming part of that story. Supporters looked at those visible changes and said, "This is what strong executive leadership can do." You could point to actual places on a map and say, "There, that changed." But the criticism never really went away either. A lot of that energy and money flowed to downtown and nearby areas like the near north, near south, and near west sides, while poorer neighborhoods often felt like they were getting a much thinner version of the city's attention. There was also a larger economic shift underneath it all. Chicago moved further from its old manufacturing identity and leaned harder into a service and destination model, which worked for some parts of the city much better than others. Daley didn't just inherit the mayor's office. He inherited a powerful democratic machine, and he made the city council far more compliant than it had been under the mayors right before him. By 2002, more than a third of the aldermen had originally been appointed by Daley, and during one 18-month stretch, fewer than one vote per month even split the council. That's not healthy disagreement. That's a very tight grip. Nothing captures his style better than Meagsfield in 2003. Just before midnight, city crews moved in and carved giant X's into the runway, shutting down the lakefront airport without consulting the city council, the governor, the FAA, or federal officials. To supporters, that was classic Daley, decisive, effective, no dithering. To critics, it was something else entirely. A mayor acting like process, law, and democratic oversight were optional if they got in the way. That same concentration of power showed up in city contracting, where Daley's administration was repeatedly tied to favoritism and insider dealing. The hired truck program is the big example. It cost about $40 million a year, and some firms were paid for little or no work. Some had alleged mafia ties, some were linked to city employees, and some were politically connected in exactly the way you'd expect people to notice. From 1996 to 2004, companies in that program gave more than $800,000 to politicians, including at least $108,575 to Daley and more than $47,500 to his brother John's ward organization. About 35% of the program's 70 firms were eventually suspended or referred to the Inspector General, which is a pretty blunt sign that this wasn't just a paperwork hiccup. The pattern reached into Daley's inner circle and family orbit too. His floor leader, Patrick Hules, resigned amid contracting and financial conflicts, and the Duff family was later indicted for allegedly getting nearly $100 million in contracts by falsely presenting firms as women or minority-owned. Daley's son Patrick and nephew Robert Van Ecko also secretly invested in a venture tied to city sewer inspection contracts and later an airport Wi-Fi deal. Patrick received 5 payments totaling $708,999, though neither he nor Van Ecko was charged. Daley also leaned hard on privatization and long-term leases to bring in immediate cash. Chicago leased out the Skyway for $1.83 billion over 99 years, city parking garages for $563 million, and parking meters for $1.16 billion over 75 years. On paper, those are huge numbers. In practice, critics said the city was selling off future public revenue to patch short-term budget problems. The parking meter deal became the most notorious one. Rates quadrupled, paid hours and days expanded, and the city had to compensate the private operator whenever streets were closed for maintenance or festivals, So even a block party could come with a meter-related invoice. Very Chicago, in its own way. And the warning critics gave turned out to matter. The parking meter money was mostly spent within 3 years, which is exactly the risk with one-time windfalls. You get a giant check once, and then you still have the underlying budget problem. By the time Daley left office, that budget problem was hard to miss. Mayor-elect Rahm Emanuel put the structural deficit at $1.2 billion when underfunded pensions were counted in. That was a dramatic change from what Daley had inherited. Annual surpluses, manageable debt, revenue-producing assets, and relatively healthy pension funds. The administration started drawing down reserves by 2006, kept increasing budgets after the Great Recession began, and by 2010, Daley was projecting a $655 million deficit, the largest in Chicago history at the time. His final budget used nearly all the remaining parking meter lease proceeds, and Fitch downgraded the city's credit rating in 2010, pointing to reserve use for operating expenses, pension underfunding, rising fixed costs, and no credible plan for new revenue. He also signed 10-year labor contracts, partly tied to Chicago's Olympic bid, which meant the next administration inherited obligations that stretched well beyond Daley's own departure. Part of what made Daley politically durable was that he blended machine politics with some genuinely progressive positions. He led Chicago's Gay and Lesbian Pride Parade in 1989, backed domestic partner benefits in 1997, endorsed same-sex marriage in 2004, and supported immigration reform and green building. That gave him a more modern image than old-school machine bosses, but his coalition still depended heavily on business interests and the careful management of race and neighborhood politics. He appointed black officials and emphasized city services across neighborhoods, but critics argued that major development still favored downtown and more affluent parts of the city, and that public housing demolition carried costs that weren't evenly shared. You can see the political wear and tear in his approval numbers. They hit 79% in 1999, then fell all the way to 35% by late 2009 as corruption scandals, budget troubles, privatization backlash, and a sense of insulation caught up with him. One of the most serious criticisms surrounding Daley wasn't about money or development at all. It was about police brutality and what happened when the system was told, plainly, what officers had done. Back in 1982, when Daley was Cook County State's attorney, he received a doctor's written report describing Andrew Wilson's bruises, radiator burns, and alleged electrical shocks during interrogation. He did not respond or bring charges against the officers. Wilson's convictions were later overturned by the Illinois Supreme Court, which ruled that his confession had been forced after police beat him. Amnesty International, the United Nations Committee Against Torture, and other groups kept criticizing Chicago's limited investigation and failure to prosecute torture allegations. That history sat in sharp contrast to Daley's public law and order image, and for many people, it remains one of the deepest moral stains connected to his career. Daley was also a very forceful gun control advocate. He said at one point that, ideally, no one but law enforcement officers would own a handgun, while admitting that wasn't politically realistic. He defended Chicago's handgun restrictions all the way up to the Supreme Court's McDonald v. Chicago case, which ultimately struck down the city's handgun ban as inconsistent with an individual's Second Amendment right. And then there was the 2010 press conference where he picked up a confiscated rifle and told a reporter, quote, "If I put this up your butt, you'll find out how effective it is." It was crude, combative, and completely on brand for a politician who never really mistook restraint for a civic virtue. Even after the ruling, he kept pushing revised licensing rules, assault weapons bans, and tighter regulation of gun shops. So Daley's legacy is both concrete and unsettled. Parks, towers, tourist polish, stronger mayoral control, and a city that looked more globally ambitious came with a bill that showed up in finances, trust, and democratic guardrails. He changed Chicago in ways nobody can seriously deny. The harder question is how much of that change was worth the price, and Chicago is still arguing about that one. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.